Hey class, welcome back to Introductory Psychology, where we are covering the King introductory text. We are moving from chapter 10 into chapter 11. The subject is social psychology, and this is a pretty interesting chapter in the sense that, for most of this course in the King text, we've kind of looked at human behavior, mental processes in terms of like the individual, how individuals react, how individuals behave, think, so on and so forth. Now we're going to think about that in terms of when the individual is around other individuals or in social settings. Social settings could be hanging out with a friend, could be hanging out with family, or it could be in large groups, small groups, crowds. I mean, all kinds of sizes. But now we're talking about how we are influenced by other people. And this is sort of like the discipline, the intersection of where psychology and sociology intersect. So if you've taken intro psych or intro soc, I should say, prior to this class, there might be some material that's, familiar from things you might have learned in sociology. But this chapter, I think, is really interesting because, again, it kind of looks at behavior and thinking in a different kind of dynamic. So this chapter, we're going to be looking at a few different sections, social cognition, how we think in terms of, in social situations, social behavior, how we behave in social situations, how that might change in social situations, how we form bonds, close relationships. Those can be romantic, platonic, and then also how we are influenced by others, and especially when it comes to group dynamics. So this is really social psychology, again, is sort of this intersection, this discipline kind of in between psychology and sociology. But this is the sort of sub discipline of psychology that specifically studies how people think about, influence, and relate to other people. So how does our behavior, our thinking change in group settings or when we're around other people? So we're going to talk about things like social cognition, how we think in social settings, how we behave in social settings, and then how we're influenced by the situation. We'll talk about the power of the situation, how that can influence our behavior and the way we think. So a lot of the research from social psychology comes literally just from observing and studying things that happen in real life. Like, for example, we can study elements of social psychology from political elections. We can see, for example, which kinds of advertisements, which kind of campaigning is more or less effective in terms of getting voter turnout, in terms of swaying voters, in terms of flipping state. I mean, all kinds of things we can look at. So, the world around us, the social world around us is this, this kind of real life laboratory where we can watch and study some of these principles we're going to talk about. But there's also elements of experimental research, of course. I mean, there's psychologists who will bring participants into a laboratory setting and manipulate certain variables in order to control for others and understand the relationship between others. So it is a combination of both. A lot of what we understand about the social nature of human beings comes from both aspects, both areas of study. So, for example, a behavior of interest to social psychologists, pro-social behavior, when people decide to help one another. And there's a really interesting relationship or a really interesting phenomena called the bystander effect. The bystander effect is whether or not you, as a bystander, if you see somebody in need of help, whether or not you're going to offer that help. And there's, research going back to the 1960s, Darley and Latane, looking at this phenomena, studying situations, putting people in situations that might evoke this bystander effect. And what they found, generally speaking, in real world observations, as well as experimental research, is that individuals are less likely to offer help, to act pro-socially in an emergency when there are more people present. So if it's just you who sees the emergency, you're much more likely to act upon that than, let's say, if there's two people around or three other people around. The more people around, it's like the diffusion of responsibility. If it's just you, it's all on you. But if there's five other people around, you might be thinking, oh, well, somebody else is going to pick up the phone and call and for help or whatever. But that really illustrates kind of that power of the situation and how we think about certain situations. This diffusion of responsibility makes it less likely that we are going to act in a pro-social way. So sort of the first kind of area we're going to look at is social cognition. How do we think? How do we select, interpret, remember, and use social information, especially when it comes to like goal completion? We have what are called person perception, the way we perceive other people. That might even include ourselves, but definitely how we think about other people or how they think about us. We use social information, social stimuli to form first impressions. So maybe that's the way somebody dresses, if somebody, if you're meeting somebody for the first time and they're dressed, really formally, and maybe they have a shirt and tie on, or they're wearing a really nice dress, if they're but if the opposite, if they showed up and they were wearing a t-shirt kind of like I'm wearing now, and they're maybe the t-shirt has holes in it, this one does not, I promise you, but you would probably have a different perception. You would think about that person differently. You would probably come to different conclusions about that individual based on those first impressions. Other cues you might rely on is physical attractiveness. There is sort of this bias in our society and in many societies of looking at sort of perceiving individuals who are more physically attractive to be good. They embody more of the quote unquote good characteristics we define good people, but that it tends to be a bias in the way human beings kind of understand attractiveness. And so when we talk about that, obviously there are differences in terms of cultural, what is deemed attractive and not, but a lot of it comes down to, that composite face, the symmetry, being more youthful in terms of expression. Those tend to be sort of universally considered attractive features. But we can sometimes, again, we can be kind of blinded by that physical attractiveness. We might be willing to look the other way, towards someone's faults because we think we associate physical attractiveness with good, even when we're not maybe consciously thinking about it. It could be a bias that's influencing our thinking and behaving without us being aware. So we have expectations as well. We create expectations based on the perceptions we have for others. One of those is the self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is the idea that an individual will act in a way that they are expected. Their expectations are realized. So I think about this in teaching. I used to teach as a high school teacher, and, you might, the previous year's teachers might tell teachers the next year, oh, you're going to love this student, or, oh, you better watch out for this student. And I think when teachers do that, they kind of create this self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that, well, if you expect a certain student to act good, for example, you might treat them as such, and you might look the other way for when behaviors that might not fit that kind of mold. And the students who, for example, you've been told ahead of time, oh, they're going to act bad, they're going to talk, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, again, that can kind of bias your thinking. And then as a teacher, you're like really hyper focused, looking for those examples when they are acting out, and maybe ignoring examples when they're acting appropriately. And so in that sense, you kind of create the climate where, they're acting as they're expected to. So for example, and kind of taking this back to that bias we talked about before, when it comes to like the, physical attractiveness is associated with quote unquote goodness. If we expect attractive people to have certain positive characteristics, to act quote unquote good, we might treat them differently. The same way in a classroom, if someone says, hey, this student is bad and this student is good, as a teacher, you might consciously or even unconsciously create a climate where they are going to act whatever way you expect them to. And this kind of gets into this idea of like stereotypes, in which we're going to dive into more deeply, that allow those negative expectations. We can have certain stereotypes about groups of people, whether it's based on race, ethnicity, religion, gender, whatever. And we, and people will only kind of cue in on those stereotypes. They're maybe not looking for examples that go against the stereotype, but they're only, so it just makes it kind of perpetuates that kind of biased thinking. Another example of social cognition is stereotype threat. A lot of this comes from the work of Claude Steele, and it's kind of building on this self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's this idea that individuals who consciously or even unconsciously fear being judged based on a stereotype might kind of fall or succumb to that particular stereotype, or basically it creates the fear of being judged based on a stereotype might create anxiety, might create tension that could perhaps even disrupt performance. So there's a lot of research that shows in education, like when individuals, for example, are asked, like if they're asked to present their gender or their race, that can evoke certain stereotypes about, for example, women not being as good at math as men, or certain races being more or less better at math or other subjects than other race and ethnicity. And by simply removing those questions, what's your gender, what's your race, saving that to the very end maybe, or just making it optional, you can avoid some of that potential stereotype threat that might evolve. Even if individuals, for example, don't normally think about those particular stereotypes, if you make them aware of it, it might evoke some of that kind of, anxiety or tension that would just potentially disrupt performance. Other aspects of social cognition, one of the biggest reasons I hear people take a psychology course a lot of times they say, well, I want to try to understand why people do and think the way they do, why they act the way they do. And social psychology offers some pretty interesting explanations for that. And one of those is called attribution theory. Really, we attribute why people do the things they do. We try to understand, why did so-and-so act this way, or why did so-and-so say this? So attribution theory is really trying to understand how and why people make the kinds of attributions they make, whether they're trying to explain their own behavior or trying to explain somebody else's behavior. So typically we talk about attribution in terms of internal, external causes, or stable, unstable causes, and then whether or not it is controllable or uncontrollable. So the attribution and then, when we are trying to explain our own behavior or other people's behavior, we're not perfect. We don't know all the facts. We don't know all of the context, especially when we're talking about other people's behavior. But that can even be the case of our own behavior. So there are certain biases or errors that individuals are prone to make when they're making attributions, and one of those is called the fundamental attribution error. And it's the idea that sometimes, especially when we are thinking about somebody else, we overestimate the importance of internal traits. We underestimate the importance of an external situation. So here's an example. So the observer tends to give an internal trait expectation of an actor's behavior, the person they're observing. So let's say in this case, she's late with a report because she can't concentrate on her own responsibilities. Can't concentrate. That is an internal explanation about why the work is late. And not really taking into account the importance of the external situation. Maybe this student, maybe her computer, just crapped out on her. She's been using the same computer for years and it finally went kaput, and, she can't afford to get a new one, and, it's going to be late. Or maybe she got COVID, who knows? Like, you are only you're trying to understand that person's behavior, the student not turning in their work, and making a attribution towards something internal rather than the context. So when an individual is trying to explain their own behavior, they're more likely to explain it in terms of external causes. This is what we call the self-serving bias, where an individual takes credit for success but denies responsibility for failure. So if they pass the test in their class, it's because they're smart. But if they fail the test, it's because their professor, maybe the test was too hard. And back to our original example. From this case, the perspective of the actor, the one who didn't turn their report on time, they might say, well, I'm late with my report because other people kept asking me to help them with their projects. There were some kind of external circumstances that took away from this student's time. And so the truth is probably more so the context, but maybe more so somewhere in the middle. It's the student can concentrate whenever they're not being distracted by other students. So that internal explanation that the instructor gave is, again, just showing the fundamental attribution error, and the student is kind of speaking from the self-serving bias. So some other ways in which we think in terms of social settings, there's also heuristics, which I think we talked about in a previous chapter. I think it might have been chapter 6 or 7. heuristics are shortcuts. Human beings, we are cognitive misers. We want to maximize our cognitive output with the least amount of effort possible. And so sometimes that is lazy thinking. And that leads to things like stereotypes, both positive and negative stereotypes. There are such things as both. We also engage in what's called the false consensus effect, where we overestimate the degree to which everyone else thinks the way we do. We think, oh, my 5 friends think like me, therefore everybody, it's like, that's clearly biased. And we use that kind of outlook, that we use that small sample size of all my friends who grew up in the same town as me, went to the same school as me, who dress and look and act like me. And we think that must be the case for everybody, when the truth probably couldn't be further from that expectation. All right, so kind of jumping back into some topics I think we looked at in personality theory, the self. Now we talked about the self, this idea, this construct of the self, and personality theory. But now when we think about it in social psychology, it is our self around other people. We know more about ourselves than we do about others around us, and that's kind of what leads to some of those types of attributions we make, fun of those errors and biases we have. But typically we value ourselves, and sometimes that we might have ourselves, we might view ourselves positively in a way that it can be an illusion, that aren't necessarily rooted in reality. Sometimes that can be beneficial, you might want to hype yourself up, make yourself sound better, sound cooler, sound stronger than maybe you really are, to kind of give yourself some motivation. Obviously there is a limitation at that. I mean, if you've never dunked a basketball before and you try to tell yourself, oh, I can dunk a basketball, I don't, good luck, without actually training and practicing, you're going to have a pretty tough time, and I might be more delusional at that point, but who's to say? We also engage in, thinking about the self. We think about the self in relation to others. So a lot of social cognition comes down to social comparison, how we evaluate the way we think, feel, and behave in relation to others. Always kind of comparing ourselves. We always think other people are watching us and comparing them. Probably chances are they're doing the same thing we are, which is just, kind of wondering the same thing. Another area of social cognition that social psychologists really like to study, both in laboratory settings and in the real life, are attitudes, how people form their opinions and beliefs about things, people, places, ideas. How do we form attitudes? If you ever get a survey, for example, like at the end of you purchase something and they give you a survey about whether or not you're going to recommend that product or recommend the store or the restaurant or whatever, they're trying to understand your attitudes. If you ever get a call or an email asking you who would you prefer to vote for in this so-and-so election, that's trying to understand your attitude. And the idea is, well, can attitudes predict behavior? If your attitude is positive about a certain candidate, does that predict that you will actually vote for them? Turns out the relationship, it does matter. For example, when their attitudes are strong, like if you really like candidate X or really dislike candidate Y, maybe you're more motivated to go out and actually vote for that person or vote against the other person. When the attitudes are rehearsed, they're familiar, you've had time to think about it, time to process it. When it has some kind of vested interest, the outcome has some kind of meaning to you. Can behaviors alter attitude, kind of the other way around? And the answer tends to be yes. If we think about cognitive dissonance theory, maybe you've heard of this theory before. It's a pretty common theory in social psych that kind of gets thrown around a lot. But the idea is when we experience discomfort, when we have two dissonant thoughts, when we say one thing and act one way, if you say, oh, I support the environment, I want to keep the planet clean, I want to help prevent climate change, things like that, but then you don't recycle, or you litter, or you drive a big diesel, big gas guzzling vehicle, that just gets like 5 miles to the gallon. And, just things. I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but, if you were to say those things, but act another way, according to cognitive dissonance theory, you're going to experience some level of discomfort, psychological discomfort, that has to be resolved one way or the other. Your attitudes aren't necessarily matching your behavior or vice versa. So in order to reduce the dissonance, you can change your behavior. So for example, if you say you support the environment, if you say you want to stop climate change, you might trade in that vehicle, or you might start recycling, or you might, open a recycling program at your work or something along those lines. Or you can change your attitude to match your behavior. Maybe you just stop going around telling everybody you're an environmentalist, or going around telling people you care about those things. You just keep driving your truck. It's the same thing about people, if you smoke cigarettes, you're like, oh, smoking is so bad, but here I am smoking. You could do one of two things. You can change your behavior, stop smoking, or you can just kind of say, we're all going to die anyways. Might as well. What does it matter if I die by a cigarette or I die by natural causes? Who cares? I don't really believe that. I'm just saying that's kind of how that dissonance. And the idea is, if we have to change our behavior to match, if we have to change our attitude to match our behavior, we have to justify the effort. We have to justify, okay, well, maybe it's, why do I keep smoking cigarettes? Why do I keep doing this thing that's clearly bad for me? Kind of thinking about the self, continuing to think about the self. Another theory is self-perception theory. We make inferences about our own attitudes by perceiving our behavior if the attitudes are unclear. So we really are trying to look for clarity. When we think about ourselves, we think about our behavior, we're trying to understand ourselves. We're trying to look for consistency and clarity, attitudes matching up with behavior, behavior matching up with attitudes. So cognitive dissonance, self-perception theory really can kind of show the relationship between attitude and behavior. We're striving for consistency. For cognitive dissonance theory, it's we're striving for consistency. I hate my job, but I work at it. I work hard at it. I need to fix my attitude. Self-perception, we infer our attitude. I spend all my time thinking how bad my job is, therefore I must really hate it. We're just kind of flipping it around a little bit and thinking about the self and thinking about, cognition. So another area of great concern to social psychologists when it comes to cognition is persuasion. How do we get somebody to adopt our attitude? How do we get somebody to change their attitude, to purchase something, to vote for somebody, all kinds of different ways we might try to convince somebody to think or act in a certain way. And one particular theory is elaboration likelihood model. And so there are two routes of persuading somebody to maybe change their attitude. You could use the central route, which is really focusing on the logic. Say, hey, if you vote for candidate X, it's going to result in policies X, Y, and Z that are beneficial for your pocketbook, for your taxes, for, national security, all kinds of things. You're pointing to very specific, concrete, logical things. This is why this would be good for you, versus peripheral route, which is focusing more on the emotions, focusing on things that aren't necessarily at the heart of the issue. Maybe it's, candidate X is a really nice person. They're the nicest person I've ever met. They have a great handshake. They're really handsome, or they're really pretty, or whatever. You're focusing on things that are outside of the specific reasons why you might vote for this person. And it's not even about voting either. In commercials, for example, if a commercial wants to sell you a product, they might talk about, if they're using the central route, they may say, hey, this product is really good. It's won awards 5 years in a row. Here they are. It's a really durable product based on X, Y, and Z. It'd be really good for you to purchase. Versus a peripheral route might be, hey, we have our favorite model or TV star or movie star likes this product, therefore you should like it too. And some companies will even use a little bit of both. They'll use central, they'll use peripheral in order to kind of encourage you to maybe buy their product or vote or whatever it might be. But persuasion usually involves one or both of these techniques. And depending on the situation, sometimes emotional focus can be really appealing, and it really depends. But human beings being persuaded, it's a complex kind of thing, but this model kind of helps sort of explain it. What can you do to resist persuasion? If somebody's trying to persuade you to do something maybe you don't want to do, or maybe you're like, hey, I'm going to vote for this person. You can counter argue. If they present X, Y, and Z, you could present counterpoints to those. Inoculate yourself. Be aware of what the other side is probably going to bring up, and have kind of have responses ready to go. So now we're going to switch gears from social cognition to social behavior. We behave in different ways when we're around other people and when they're around us. I mean, think about your job. Like, if you're working by yourself, I don't know what you do for a living, but if you're working by yourself, you're probably doing it a certain way. But if all of a sudden your boss comes standing next to you and just working with you, you're probably going to work in a different way, and multiply that by the more people we add into the situation. Our behavior tends to change when we're around other people. In terms of like social behavior, there are a couple of extremes. how we react in around other people. In some cases, we act in pro-social ways that are helpful to our fellow human beings. We call this altruism, helping other people. And then another way of behaving socially is through aggression. Aggression doesn't always have to be physical. It can be social aggression, emotional aggression, all of it, it comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but it's the opposite of altruism. We're trying to hurt somebody else. And that could be for a number of reasons. I mean, it could be for self-defense, it could be for offense, it could be politically motivated, socially motivated, all kinds of reasons. But those are kind of the two extremes when it comes to social behavior. So let's focus on the first one, which is altruism. It's when we help somebody in an unselfish way. It's helping somebody without necessarily an expectation that they're going to do something for you. Helping your roommate move, knowing that they're going to do the same for you. It's helpful, but maybe it's not necessarily altruism. It's kind of like you scratch my back, I scratch your back. So that might be more of an example of egoism, where you're helping somebody, ideally for personal enhancement. I'm going to, again, scratch your back, you scratch my back. And a lot of helping looks like that too. I'm not trying to say one is better than the other, but the intentions, the motivation behind them will look different. So egoism is more like reciprocity. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, gains in self-esteem, helping others to kind of present yourself as someone who's more powerful, competent, caring, like it's what they might say, you're flexing, so to speak, or avoiding self-censure due to certain social expectations. See, I helped out, you can't say this about me. You can't say I'm a bad guy. I'm helping my friends out. So what are some explanations for altruism, helping other people? There's there's an evolutionary explanation. We thrive better as a society, as a species, if we're helping each other out, if we're being constructive rather than being destructive. Like, that's just beneficial to the species. It helps us survive in terms of passing on genes. I think, again, it's just this idea that it's more beneficial. We're kind of signaling through sort of that cost, the reciprocity cost of, I'm going to help you out. This is a sort of long-term scheme of things better for the species. And also, there's a lot of research that shows that when we help others, especially when we act altruistically, it improves mood, improves well-being, physically, emotionally, psychologically. What are some biological factors? Well, it feels good. Again, we see increases in chemistry, brain chemistry, serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, those feel-good chemicals in our brain and our bloodstream. It feels good when we do those things. It's also associated with certain areas of the brain that are associated with nurturing, helping other people. So psychologically as well, there are factors. It's a biopsychosocial phenomenon. We get to deal and experience empathy. Individuals who are higher in agreeableness, getting along with others, tend to be more altruistic. If your mood tends to be more positive rather than negative, we would expect pro-social altruistic behavior. Sociocultural factors, your socioeconomic status, your background. People from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to be more helpful. There's an empathy and understanding. Hey, I'm in the same situation you are, or I was not that long ago. And so getting help from your neighbors, getting help from your community. Gender, this is really looking at gender in terms of a binary. So we want to be very clear that this is not the most nuanced understanding of gender, but we do tend to see men tend to be more nurturing in terms of altruism, or women, men tend to be more rescuing. But again, that's really looking at things very black and white, and gender is not one of those things that's black and white. So take that with a grain of salt. There's also media influence. For example, if you see a disaster, if you see something on television, you might feel compelled to reach out. Seeing a natural disaster in your home, in your state, you might realize, oh, I want to help out. I used to live in that town. I'm gonna, donate or my time or my money, to help out. The other side of the coin is aggression. And aggression is kind of built into our DNA, for lack of a better term. There is a biological influence in terms of our genes. This is evident in non-humans, not just humans. It's more clear in non-humans. You kind of see aggression kind of hardwired right in, when it literally is survival of the fittest, when it's, do or die, eat or be eaten, it's pretty clear. Human beings, it's not as clear. It's a little more subtle, how that might be affected by genetics. There's also neurobiological factors, the limbic system, the frontal lobes of the brain, kind of knowing when and when not to be aggressive. Lower levels of serotonin are associated with aggression, high levels of testosterone. So kind of a, inverse relationship there, low serotonin, high testosterone. Psychological influences, personality types, for example, being low in agreeableness, low in conscientiousness, high in neuroticism, so emotional instability. People who are put in aversive circumstances, when frustrated, when they're tired, when they're hot or cold, when they're in pain, when they're crowded, when there's loud noises, when they're annoyed. I mean, those things can increase aggression. Being primed by your environment, simply holding a weapon can make individuals feel more aggressive, like holding a fake gun can evoke more testosterone, which evokes more aggression. So, there's a lot of reasons. Observational learning. We talked about that, I think, in our chapter on learning theory, the Bobo doll experiment by Albert Bandura. We also see aggression in family, in our environment when we see it growing up. Other influences, sociocultural influences, cultural variations, like, living in the South of the United States, for example, there is this idea of a culture of honor. If somebody besmirches your honor, you have a sort of a societal kind of expectation to defend your honor, for better or worse. In terms of aggression and gender, you're more likely to see overt kind of aggression with males. You're more likely to see with females relational aggression. Maybe that's more like the Mean Girls kind of spreading rumors, picking on somebody, that kind of aggression. Media violence. There's a lot of controversy about media violence in terms of does watching violent TV or playing violent video games, does that lead to violence itself? There's no cause and effect necessarily here, but consuming media violence, I've read articles recently that shows that family dynamics, for example, is an interesting variable that might play into whether or not individuals, if they're consuming violent media, are they more likely to be aggressive? It's not, X causes Y. There's a lot of mediating factors in between that could be, influencing that relationship. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense that says media violence causes people to, to commit violence, because there's plenty of people who play violent video games who don't go out and commit violence. Myself included. I like playing video games, and I don't always love playing violent ones, but sometimes I do, and very rarely, if ever, have I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna want to go out and hurt somebody now. It's usually like, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, oh cool, I got to go just do some things in a video game that I would never do in real life, and I feel better now. I feel I got my frustration or annoyance out, or whatever that might be. So what about relationships? How do we form bonds with other people, close relationships, romantic relationships specifically, but really any kind of, close relationship is important, especially as we continue to age. It's really important to establish and figure out how to maintain those, close relationships. So limitations on what we understand about relationships, it should be, pretty upfront. For example, attraction among individuals who identify as LGBTQ+ have not been fully explored compared to individuals who might just describe as being heterosexual, for example. Research on attraction, couple functioning, for example, in groups who are minoritized, people of color, is also somewhat limited. A lot of our research about couples and relationships comes from college students, white college students, male, female, heterosexual college students, but that's changing. So some of these things we might want to take with a grain of salt. So close relationships, what leads to attraction, interpersonal attraction? There's physical attractiveness, proximity. The mere exposure effect says the more oftentimes we're exposed to a certain stimuli, the more we come to like it. So maybe initially we don't have an attraction for somebody, but if we keep, seeing that same person again and again, we develop a liking. Similarity helps. People are more likely to like people who are like us, whether it's true or whether it's perceived. We're more likely to attract people who are similar to us. Relationships also, it's kind of this understanding, is it the evolutionary perspective, keeping the species going? The social roles view is that we have a part to play. So there's kind of some different explanations about why we might want to fulfill or develop close relationships. And ideally, those relationships develop into love, where we share an interest with our partner, whether we're talking about romantic or platonic relationships. But I think the primary focus is romantic, having a warm, trustworthy relationship that that is satisfying to both parties. And love kind of changes. It evolves over time in a relationship. So typically you might start off, a relationship with romantic love where passion is really high. There's, sexuality is higher, infatuation is higher. There's just, it's really intense on all levels. But over time, we can't expect that same intensity to last for the entirety of the relationship. The relationship might evolve into what's called affectionate love, where it's more companionate. The affection is more deep and caring. Maybe it's not necessarily as hot as it once was, but it's more consistent. Maybe when you first got together, your intensity was at like an 11, but now it's much more maybe a consistent 7, 8, somewhere like that. Maybe it's not quite as high, but it's still definitely going. We also learn a lot about relationships from observing other relationships, maybe our parents or our friends or how they interact with each other. We have this idea of social exchange theory, fair exchange of goods. It's kind of this idea somewhat of you scratch my back, I scratch yours, but that's how a lot of friendships are based, especially when we're developing friendships early on in life. There's this kind of fair exchange of goods. You're my friend, you come over and watch, you come over and watch dumb movies with me, and I sit there and listen to your problems while we watch dumb movies together. It's kind of like this tit for tat kind of trade. It's this exchange of goods. Socially speaking, it's not necessarily money, but it's, the goods, the social goods, so to speak. And the idea behind this is to minimize costs, maximize benefits. Another way of thinking about it is the investment model. In terms of investing in a relationship, I don't mean putting money into it. Sometimes it could be money, but also it might just mean, how committed you are to that person, how much investment in terms of your time, your effort, your emotions are you putting into it. And also that might factor in, lack of alternatives. If nobody else if you only have one, there's only one person who will put up with you, you might want to be pretty invested in that, versus if you've got like 20 people that are willing to put up with you, maybe you think about it in a different way. Some other aspects of how we are influenced by others is conformity. When individuals change their behavior to coincide, to kind of fall in line with a certain group standard, and to some extent conformity is necessary for society to function. Like we have to conform to, for example, like the rules of traffic to have a functioning experience of when we operate motor vehicles. So to some degree we're all conformists, but there is such thing as maybe too much conformity or conformity to the extreme. And looking at that, Solomon Asch studied conformity in the 1950s by running an experiment where individuals would be exposed to a line like this called the standard line. And then they were asked, hey, which of these three here in this other card is the same as the standard line. But the caveat was that if you were in this research, you would be the last person to reply out loud what the answer was. Whereas everybody else would be in a row and they would give their answer before you, but those people were in on it and they intentionally gave the wrong answer. They would say it's A when it should be B, or say it's C when it should have been B. They're intentionally giving the wrong answer. And the idea was, we want to see if you, not knowing what's going on, if you would intentionally give the wrong answer to conform. This kind of influence, when we're influenced to conform, sometimes we might conform in terms of information. We want to know more. We want to get along, to understand how things work better. Other times we're influenced via normative social influence. We want to do so to not make waves, to kind of get along with our friends, So there's several reasons why we might conform, but Asch's studies show that the majority of people, as long as they were, kind of publicly asked to present their answer after everyone else gave the wrong answer, were more likely to conform. There are also biological explanations. For example, people feel uncomfortable when you do something that is considered an error. So like giving the quote unquote wrong answer in front of everybody else, even though you might think it's true, it is the right answer, that non-conformity might lead to a sense of tension or anxiety or dissonance. Cultural explanations, collectivist cultures tend to be more associated with conformity than individualistic. We talked about those kind of different cultures, I believe, in a previous chapter. But thinking more about the we versus I tends to lead to more conformity. Kind of thinking about conformity, there's also obedience, obeying authority figures. And we know a lot about that from Stanley Milgram, who conducted a series of studies across a decade of research looking at why people obey authority figures. And he was very curious about this because Stanley Milgram at the time was a social psychologist, a Jewish social psychologist working for Yale. And he wanted to know, could the Holocaust happen in the United States? Was that just unique to Germany? Were these Germans just evil people? Or is this something in the wrong situation? Could this happen anywhere? And instead of asking people to think about a moral situation and talk about how they would do it, he put people in a situation where they might have to be to figure out how willing are they to obey an objectionable order, something they probably shouldn't do. So what he did is he put individuals in one room and told, hey, you're going to be the teacher in this learning experiment. And in the other room, you're going to be able to communicate with a two-way kind of radio comm system. You'll be able to talk back and forth. The other room is the learner. You're going to be doing some word association games. And every time the individual gets it wrong, you're going to push a button that will deliver a small, non-lethal, non-painful, or it maybe causes discomfort, but it's not going to cause any damage, an electric shock. But each time they get one wrong, you're also going to turn up the intensity as well. We're going to turn it up by 15 volts. And what Milgram found out was from the researcher acting as a authority figure, most subjects under the different versions of this study were willing to go the whole way, meaning they were willing to administer the highest amount of electricity to another person, even when the other person was claiming they were in pain, claiming they had a heart condition, all kinds of factors. Now, the person on the other side of the wall, the other room, was not actually being shocked or electrocuted or anything like that. These were pre-recorded responses, but the person pushing the buttons was made to believe that that was actually happening. And those who tended to quit when the learner first requested to halt. They were going to take a stand early, but if there was kind of this like point of no return, where if you were willing to administer a certain amount of voltage, you were very likely to keep going all the way. And this research also raised a lot of concerns about ethics, kind of convincing people to do things they didn't think they were capable of. And it was important to debrief these individuals and let them know, hey, you weren't really shocking people on the other side of the wall. So the idea is, obedience. It complies with these explicit demands of an authority figure. This research has been duplicated. Berger, for example, in 2009, replicated the research, limiting the voltage to a much lower, basically stopping at that point of no return. And the factors that were explaining the tendency, the novelty of the situation. If you've never heard of this experiment before or never been in a situation like this, it can be stressful, it can be overwhelming. So maybe you're more likely to listen to the authority figure. Normative information being provided by the experimenter saying, hey, please go on. I'll be the one to take responsibility. You have to continue. Opportunity to deny responsibility. If you can just point to the researchers, hey, they told me to do it. I was just taking orders, like a lot of what the Nazis said in the Nuremberg trials. Limited time to think. If you didn't have a lot of time to think, if it was just, hey, please continue, please continue. The less time you had to think, the less likely you would be to resist obedience. Also, when people are in groups, they tend to act in strange ways. One of those ways is called de-individuation, where a sense of personal identity and responsibility is like, poof, it's gone. It vanishes, disappears once we are in a crowd. Think about next time you're at a sporting event. If you're at like a basketball game and the away team is shooting free throws, everybody all of a sudden goes, boo. they make that sound, boo sound, which is fine. It makes a lot of sense in person. But if you would never do that as an individual. If you went up and just started booing somebody as an individual, you would, it would come across as quite weird. That's a really minor example. Obviously, sometimes people in extreme cases, like members of the Ku Klux Klan, who wear masks and robes and things like that to hide their identity, can definitely succumb to some of this de-individuation and they become more anonymous in the crowd. There's also this element of social contagion. Ideas, behaviors can spread, for good or for worse. Sometimes ideas will spread, emotions will spread, ideas will spread. Like I think about like the response to, George Floyd's murder, for example. There, a lot of people were angry about that. It didn't just resonate in the town where it happened, the city where it happened. It spread it spread a social contagion. Almost like a social, just same way a contagion would spread. It's very rapid, very fast. It didn't take very long. It didn't take a lot of time. You didn't have to see it happen personally. You could have heard about it. You could have seen maybe a secondhand account and be angry about it. And then still those ideas spread pretty quickly. Group performance is also influenced when we're around other people. In some cases, we might want to perform better. This is called social facilitation. If it's something we're really good at, something we're familiar with, being around other people can actually enhance performance. The opposite also might be true. Social loafing, things that maybe we don't feel as comfortable with, we might kind of default to the group and let other people kind of take the responsibility. You can actually test this and measure this in games of tug of war, kind of see who's giving effort, who's not. When we're in groups, we're also more likely to make riskier decisions than we are by ourselves. This is called a risky shift. Groups are also more likely to be polarized, kind of going towards one extreme or the other, less likely to kind of find that middle position. Group think is another area where decision-making is impaired whenever, we're more focused on kind of group cohesion than realistic appraisal of the actual outcomes of the situation, of the context. The idea is, hey, we'd rather maintain group harmony. There's a sense of overconfidence, closed-mindedness, a high level of conformity or uniformity. What can you do to avoid groupthink? Engage in majority-minority influence, normative, informational social influence, kind of giving everybody, equal say, allowing minority participants stakes. I don't mean ethnic, racial minority. I mean, you just simply, if, there's a group of 5 and two of you are one way and 3 are the other, you obviously have a majority, you have a minority, but kind of maintaining that pressure, making sure that both parties have a certain degree of influence, even if, it's not just majority rule, there's kind of a voice at stake, even for people who are in the minority. So when it comes to social interactions, there's also this idea of intergroup, relations. Each one of us has a social identity, how we kind of define ourselves, and we probably, you probably have multiple identities. Right now, like I'm a teacher, I'm a rugby player, I'm a husband, I'm a dog owner, I'm a friend, I'm a brother. I mean, all of these different roles are kind of fit into my social identity, and you as well. Probably you could write down probably quite a few off the top of your head. And each one of those has a different kind of expectation in terms of, how you're supposed to act, how you're supposed to behave. This idea also leads to what's called social identity theory, where we have in groups and out groups. In group is the group you belong to. Out group is everybody else. So, for example, I like the University of Oklahoma as a football team. All the OU fans are the in group, and if you like Texas, for example, you're the out group, and you're seen as the rival. And in football, that's fine. That's like not a big deal. But that kind of thinking is also what pervades, racial, ethnic thinking about racism and treating one group better than the other because they're with my group, they're like me, and this other group's not like me. So that's where it can become kind of problematic. There's this idea of ethnocentrism, where we're more likely to favor groups who are like us, especially when it comes to like ethnic groups. Like, I only listen to music by people who are like me. I only hang out with people who are like me. I'm distrustful of people who are not like, so that's where that kind of social identity thinking, ethnocentric thinking comes in. It clearly becomes problematic pretty quickly. So we can think about our identity, if you are religious or if you belong to a certain ethnic group, what kind of relationships you're involved in, what's your job or what's your hobbies. What's your political affiliation? You know, what kind of, maybe you belong to a stigmatized identity, you know, all kinds of different groups. Our group identity is a unique reflection of a number of these things here, and probably others that aren't even listed. You know, and kind of based off this in-group, out-group thinking can lead to prejudice, you know, having a negative attitude about a group or its members, and its members, I should say. And prejudice can lead to things like systemic racism, setting up structures in society that prevent certain groups from, you know, from getting ahead, or maybe disadvantaging one group in favor of another group, which, you know, is displayed in terms of explicit racism, like what happened in the Holocaust, what was happening with Jim Crow laws in the United States, or the treatment of indigenous tribes in the United States. There's also implicit racism, where people kind of have these deeper hidden, you know, maybe racist, ethnocentric, prejudiced values and attitudes that maybe they're not even aware of. You know, maybe it's you cross the street when you see somebody, you know, of a different ethnicity, and you're not even aware of it. You're like, oh, I didn't even realize it. Like, why am I crossing the street when somebody who's different from me? You know, people, you might make biased decisions, who might, you know, people who might not even think they're racist might do things that are biased and you know, kind of that implicit racism without even necessarily being aware of it. But the prejudice thinking comes from stereotypes, whether they're positive or negative. It's a generalization about all members of a group, and even positive stereotypes can be a bad, you know, can be a bad thing, like thinking, oh, if you belong to this ethnic group, you must be really good at math, you know? But what if you're the kid who belongs to the ethnic group who's not good at math? Or maybe they like other, you know, you like something else, you like language arts, you like science, you like something totally different. So prejudice, what are some factors? You know, competition between groups, that in-group, out-group bias, you know, parental attitudes. It is taught, like racism, prejudice, sexism, xenophobia, all those things can be taught. Unfortunately, they are. You know, if we are only exposed to people like us, we're more likely to kind of have those negative attitudes. And then stereotypes, you know, categorical thinking. It is simply easier to think in stereotypes. It is easier to simplify the world that way. It's not always, it's not correct, but it is an easier, simpler way of thinking about the world. So stereotypes, these are generalizations, microaggressions. These are kind of everyday, subtle, or unintentional acts that kind of communicate bias to certain groups of people, you know, kind of letting them know in subtle ways that those stereotypes are influencing the thinking. Discrimination is actually acting upon stereotypes. So stereotypes are attitudes. Discrimination is the actual behavior. You know, stereotypes, you know, stereotypes typically will feed into discrimination, some kind of harmful act. So how can these relationships be improved? There's some really interesting research that looks into improving group relationships, interaction, you know, interacting from different groups. So contact is one way, but it's not effective. It's not the most effective thing in the world. There has to be the sense of equality. It has to be a sense of encouragement of interaction from an authority figure, anticipation of friendships. Like, this isn't just some kind of like token, like, oh, let's bring people together and hope it works out. It's like there's actual goals we're trying to set here, kind of bringing people together who weren't together before. Also, a lot of research shows that putting people together to work on a shared task can really go a long way to kind of bring the walls down in terms of that in-group, out-group, you know, kind of bias or butting heads. There's a lot of research specifically from the state of Oklahoma. Sharif looked at Robbers Cave, the study where he put together a research project where he had two kind of Boy Scout groups. One was the Eagles, one was the Rattlers. And at first they were in a tournament where they had to compete against each other. And he, had them basically compete against each other in all kinds of games. And what they found out was they had very different perceptions of each other, these negative perceptions of each other when they were surveyed kind of after their tournament, high levels of negative perception. Like the Eagles didn't like the Rattlers and vice versa. But then he flipped it around, and the rest of their camp experience, he had them work together on like joint projects to make the campsite better, or, to build things on the campsite. And those scores plummeted. The Rattlers and the Eagles were more likely to get along. They're more likely to be friends. They're more likely to see each other positively than negatively. So joint cooperation is a good thing. So, those implicit prejudice, sometimes prejudice it's a habitual, it's a way of thinking. We may not even necessarily be aware of it. but ultimately, in order to change that kind of thinking, you have to be aware of it. There's like an implicit bias test individuals can take, and you can kind of figure out maybe where are some of the blind spots you might have. Every single person is biased to some degree. We all have blind spots, whether it's about culture, race, ethnicity, whatever. But the only way to actually fix those things is to be aware of them. Otherwise, to remain ignorant is definitely not the answer. So that's going to wrap it up for chapter 11. We're going to stop here, and we'll pick back up with chapter 12. I believe we're getting into psychological disorders for chapter 12. So thanks for sticking around. I'll see you all next time. Take care. Peace.